Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're taking a deep dive into Sarah Crosby Mallory Paine's The Japanese Empire, Grand Strategy from the Meiji Restoration to the Pacific War.
Mm-hmm.
This book, well, it really takes a comprehensive look at how Japan figured out and then executed its grand strategy. Starting way back in the mid-19th century, right through to its defeat in 45.
That's right. And Paine really unpacks how all these different factors play together. Things like building new institutions, how they dealt with the changing world stage, that tricky balance between civilian leaders and the military.
And also how they saw the world, geopolitically speaking, and crucially, their relationship with China. It all weaves together.
Exactly. And the book asks this core question. Why did Japan's push for great power status work out so differently in its early wars compared to, well, the later ones?
It's a fascinating question. So we'll be tracing several themes, right? Things like maybe incomplete institutional development.
Yeah, that's a big one. Also, the challenge of adapting to this constantly shifting global environment. And as I mentioned, that delicate, often failing balance between civilian control and military ambition.
We'll also touch on how their understanding of geopolitics, which was really shaped by this drive to westernize and that increasingly difficult relationship with China, steered their choices.
It all connects.
Okay, let's get into it then. Starting right at the beginning. The Meiji Restoration, 1868. This was a period of just immense change, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Transformative is the word. It was kicked off by this dawning awareness of Western power, Western tech.
And then came the Charter Oath. What was that about?
Well, it laid out this new vision: unity, economic growth, getting the public involved, meritocracy, ability counting more than birth, and basically ditching old customs that weren't working anymore. It was a fundamental reset for Japan.
And a really striking part, Paine emphasizes this, is how Japan deliberately turned away from China and towards Western models for its new institutions after centuries of Chinese influence.
Right. That was a huge U-turn. And it directly challenged China's view of itself as, the center of civilization. That shift had massive long-term consequences for their relationship.
You could imagine. So what were some of the key reforms that came out of this?
Oh, it was a whirlwind. They got rid of the old feudal domains in 1869. Bang, centralized power. Started compulsory elementary education in 72, investing in people.
And the military?
A modern military built fast. Universal conscription came in 1873. Then they set up an army general staff in 78, looking very much like the Prussian system, which was seen as, super efficient.
And the Navy followed suit.
Yep, modeled on the British Royal Navy. But their strategic thinking, especially for the Navy, got a big injection from an American Admiral Mahan.
Alfred Thayer Mahan. Yeah, his ideas about sea power were hugely influential everywhere, weren't they?
Incredibly so. And Paine notes how much of his work was translated into Japanese really quickly. It shows you how focused they were on becoming a naval power.
What's fascinating, too, is the thinking behind it all. This embrace of Western logic.
Exactly. They use these ideas of logical consistency to look critically at their own traditions, figure out what needed changing to become more, well, effective, more powerful.
Did they have a grand strategy even then?
There were early signs. Paine quotes one senior leader basically saying, look, let's get our relations with Europe sorted before we even think about moving into Korea. So some strategic prioritization was happening.
Okay, let's jump ahead then. Mid-1890s. The First Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95. What's driving this?
At its core, it's Japan's ambition. They want to change the power balance in East Asia. They see China, the Qing dynasty, as weakening, and they want to grab influence, especially in Korea, maybe before Russia does.
So the stated goals, Korean sovereignty, reform, there was more of a cover.
Pretty much. The underlying aim was Japanese dominance in the region.
And China, at this point, was not in a great position to push back effectively.
Not at all. They were dealing with internal rebellions, regional wars. Paine really stresses their difficulty in even setting clear strategic goals, let alone creating a unified plan to achieve them.
They were also hesitant about some modern tech, weren't they? Like railways.
Yeah, concerns about feng shui traditional geomancy actually held back railway construction in some areas. It sounds strange to us, but it limited their ability to move troops and supplies quickly. A huge contrast to Japan's approach.
Definitely.
And their defenses were still very much province-based. No real unified national defense structure. Plus, Paine suggests their long history, their past achievements, almost blinded them. They underestimated how much the world and Japan had changed.
Strategic blindness, you might call it.
Something like that, yeah.
What was the immediate spark for the war? The book mentions the Kaohsiung incident.
Right, the sinking of the British transport Kaohsiung carrying Chinese troops. That was the spark. But, as Paine points out, these sparks only ignite when there's dry tinder. Korea itself was unstable. Foreign powers like Britain, China, Russia were all meddling.
And the Korean monarchy was playing them off against each other.
Exactly. Then you had the Tongak Rebellion inside Korea, which gave Japan a perfect excuse to send in troops, supposedly to protect its interests.
And they didn't waste time declaring war formally.
Nope. Surprise attack. Classic move. They split their forces, first and second armies.
And the Chinese response. You mentioned Viceroy Li Hongzhang.
Yeah, he controlled most of the Chinese forces sent out. But strangely, even though China had a modern navy on paper, pretty decent, he favored fighting on land. He actually ordered his main fleet to stay away from the Korean coast.
Really? He just gave up sea control.
Effectively, yes. A massive strategic blunder right at the start. It basically handed naval superiority to Japan.
So Japan racks up victories, Pyongyang on land, the Yalu River at sea.
Right. The Battle of the Yalu River was decisive for naval dominance. Then came the capture of Lushan, or Port Arthur.
Which became notorious for something else too, didn't it?
Tragically, yes. The capture itself was made easier by a Chinese planning mistake. But afterwards, Japanese troops carried out a massacre of Chinese civilians. It was brutal, caused a huge international outcry, and the Japanese government had to do some serious damage control.
Were the Japanese leaders all on the same page strategically, though?
Not entirely. Paine highlights a disagreement. You had General Yamagata wanting to march on Beijing, but Prime Minister Icho pushed back.
Why?
Icho worried that if the Qing dynasty collapsed completely, it would just create chaos, maybe lead to other powers jumping in to carve up China. It shows there were different strategic calculations being made even within the Japanese leadership.
Interesting. So did their war aims change after Lushan?
They did. The focus shifted away from maybe taking Beijing towards completely knocking out China's remaining naval power. The target became Wei Highway, the main base for China's northern fleet.
Take out the fleet, secure the seas.
Precisely. Establish Japan as the undisputed naval power in the region.
And the peace negotiations at Shimonoseki. Sounds like they were tough for China.
Extremely tough. Li Hongzhang had a terrible hand to play. Japan kept upping the demands. They eventually added Taiwan to the list of territories they wanted ceded.
But then other powers stepped in. The triple intervention.
Right. Russia, Germany, and France ganged up and basically forced Japan to give back the Liaodong Peninsula, which included Lushan, that strategic port they'd captured.
That must have felt like a slap in the face for Japan.
It did, but they got a bigger financial indemnity from China instead. And this intervention, well, it had huge long-term consequences.
Like what?
For China, it was deeply humiliating. It really marked the start of this long downward spiral in relations with Japan. It also kicked off a new scramble for concessions in China by the Western powers and Russia.
And for Japan. What do they do with that bigger indemnity?
They plowed it straight back into building up their military even more, preparing for the next round, essentially.
And domestically, the war was a win for the Meiji government.
Oh, yeah. It totally legitimized all those westernizing reforms in the eyes of the public. Nationalism surged. But ironically, in Korea, it just fizzled more hatred towards Japan, led to things like the assassination of Queen Min by Japanese agents, and kind of killed off Japan's early reform efforts there.
And Paine argues the war had an even deeper impact.
Yeah, she argues it fundamentally shattered the old Confucian bedrock of Chinese civilization. China's defeat was so comprehensive, it exposed the weakness of its traditional system in the face of this modernizing neighbor, a real shock to this system.
Wow. Okay, so fast forward only about 10 years, and Japan's in another major conflict.
Yeah.
The Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905. What's the story here?
Fundamentally, it's a direct clash of empires. Both Japan and Russia want control over Korea and Manchuria in Northeast Asia. It's a zero-sum game in their eyes.
And Japan felt they had to act quickly.
Yeah, they saw this window of opportunity. Russia was building the Trans-Siberian Railway, and once that was fully operational, Russia's ability to send troops and supplies east would increase massively. Japan felt they needed to strike before that happened.
Did they try diplomacy first?
They did. There were negotiations about spheres of influence. Maybe Russia gets Manchuria, Japan gets Korea, but they broke down. Neither side was willing to concede enough.
Was Russia as strong as it looked?
Outwardly, maybe. But internally, Russia had problems. Political instability, economic issues, and, as it turned out, significant military weaknesses despite its size.
And Japan had learned some things since the war with China.
Definitely. They had the Anglo-Japanese alliance, which was huge. It meant Britain would likely stay neutral, maybe even discourage other powers like France from helping Russia. They'd learned tactical lessons from the Sino-Japanese War, and Paine mentions they were also quite savvy at cultivating connections with influential people in Britain and the U.S.
Networking as grand strategy.
Sort of.
And again, the war starts with the surprise attack.
Yep, on the Russian fleet bottled up in Port Arthur, just like before.
Was the Russian leadership effective?
Not really. Paine points to major flaws. Tsar Nicholas II kept interfering, which undermined his commanders. There was confusion about who was really in charge in the Far East War Minister Kropotkin or the Viceroy Alexeyev. Plus, they faced huge logistical hurdles, consistently underestimated the Japanese, and their navy was poorly managed.
So Japan had the edge in organization and maybe spirit.
Seems that way. The book details the key battles. On land, there was another battle of the Yalu River, the long, bloody siege of Port Arthur, Liaoyang, and then the absolutely massive battle of Shenyang, or Mukden, as it's often called.
Yeah.
Huge numbers of troops involved.
But the really decisive battle was at sea, wasn't it? Tsushima.
Oh, Tsushima was legendary. Admiral Tuju's fleet just annihilated the Russian Baltic fleet, which had sailed literally halfway around the world only to be destroyed in the Tsushima Strait. It was a stunning, decisive naval victory, probably one of the most decisive in history.
But Japan was pushing its limits too, right?
Absolutely. By the time Mukden was fought, Japan was nearing exhaustion. Manpower, money, resources all stretched incredibly thin.
So why did the war end?
Well, Tsar Nicholas had his own problems back home. The 1905 revolution was brewing. He seems to have decided that maintaining order in Russia was more important than continuing this costly, far-off war.
And the U.S. stepped in to mediate.
That's right. President Theodore Roosevelt mediated the peace talks, leading to the Treaty of Portsmouth.
How did the Japanese feel about the outcome?
Mixed feelings, especially in the military. There was this strong sense among many officers that they'd won the battles, but the civilians lost the peace. They felt the treaty didn't give them everything their military victories deserved, especially a financial indemnity like they got from China.
That sounds like a dangerous lesson to take away.
It was. It reinforced this idea that military force was the ultimate answer and maybe civilian politicians couldn't be trusted to secure the spoils of war. And overconfidence in military power started to creep in.
What were the key Russian failures, according to Paine?
A big one was not really studying or learning from the First Sino-Japanese War, even though this conflict was happening right in the same neighborhood where Russia had interests. They also made bad strategic choices with their navy. Splitting the fleet between Port Arthur, which was vulnerable, and Vladivostok, further north, made them easier to defeat in detail.
And the war's impact on Japan's strategy going forward.
It had a significant and maybe negative long-term impact. The generation of Meiji leaders, the oligarchs who had guided the modernization, started passing away. Paine argues that this led to a decline in really sophisticated, unified strategic thinking.
And rivalries grew.
Exactly. Damaging rivalries between the Army and the Navy really took hold. They started pulling in different directions, which undermined any chance of a coherent grand strategy like they'd had earlier.
Okay, so this brings us into the period after the Russo-Japanese War. Paine talks about a shift towards continental security. What does that mean?
Well, first, they tightened their grip on Korea, annexing it outright in 1910. No more pretense. Internally, you see the old Meiji oligarchs fading, political parties gaining some influence, but crucially, the military, especially the army, becoming much more powerful and assertive in politics.
And the army looked towards China.
Increasingly, yes. China was unstable after the Qing dynasty fell in 1911. The Japanese army saw opportunities and started pushing for a strategy focused on carving out a sphere of influence on the continent, starting with Manchuria.
We see that with the 21 demands in 1915.
Absolutely. Those demands made on China were a clear signal of Japan's growing ambitions, and over time, you see civilian political influence shrinking, while the military, say, in foreign policy and strategy just kept growing.
Which leads us to the Manchurian incident in 1931, a really crucial moment.
Absolutely pivotal. There were underlying causes, of course. The Great Depression hit Japan hard. Chinese nationalism was rising, pushing back against foreign privileges and those unequal treaties. There were anti-Japanese boycotts in China. Manchuria itself was pretty unstable.
And the immediate trigger.
There were a couple of incidents like the Wanbaoshan incident, but the big one was the Mukden incident, an explosion on the Japanese-controlled South Manchuria Railway. And critically, Paine stresses, this was engineered by rogue elements within the Japanese Kwantung Army stationed in Manchuria.
So the army acted on its own. Without orders from Tokyo.
Largely, yes. It was a case of the military going rogue, creating a pretext to seize territory. It caused a massive political crisis back in Tokyo, led to the fall of the cabinet, and ultimately China's too.
And the result was Manchukuo.
Yes, they set up the puppet state of Manchukuo in Manchuria. This cemented Japan's continental path and was also driven by a desperate need for resources. Manchuria was seen as this vital resource base Japan lacked.
This seems like an inevitable path towards a bigger war with China.
It certainly set the stage for the Second Sino-Japanese War, which broke out in 1937. The underlying causes were deep: the ongoing Chinese Civil War, all the unresolved tensions, Japan's relentless expansionism. The situation was incredibly tense.
What lit the fuse this time?
The Marco Polo Bridge incident. A minor skirmish between Japanese and Chinese troops near Beijing. But in that volatile atmosphere, it was enough to escalate into full-blown war.
Did Japan expect a quick victory?
It seems they did. They made some major miscalculations about Chinese resistance. They really underestimated the willingness and ability of the Chinese to fight back.
And the Chinese factions actually united, didn't they?
Remarkably, yes. The Second United Front was formed. The Communists and the Nationalists put aside their own civil war, temporarily at least, to fight the common enemy. This presented Japan with a much tougher, more unified opposition than they'd bargained for.
The war then just escalated and spread.
Massively, and it became incredibly brutal. Japanese military actions expanded across huge parts of China. Paine details the horrific atrocities committed, which only fueled Chinese nationalism further and hardened their resolve.
Japan also had this strategy of living off the land.
Yeah, providing for the war by war. Basically, seizing resources from occupied areas. It was devastating for the Chinese population and ultimately wasn't sustainable even for Japan. It created enormous logistical problems and widespread resentment.
Paine also mentions Japan using some pretty dark methods.
Tragically, yes. Opium was used systematically to weaken Chinese society and even help fund the war effort. They used poison gas on the battlefield. And then there was the horrific germ warfare research and human experimentation conducted at Unit 731 in Manchukuo. Just appalling acts.
So the war just dragged on. No quick victory for Japan.
Not at all. It became a brutal stalemate, a quagmire. Japan occupied vast territories but couldn't achieve its political goals. They couldn't break Chinese resistance or establish the stable Japan-dominated order they wanted. It just bled both countries dry economically and in terms of human life.
And this huge, draining war in China is the backdrop for Japan's next big gamble, expanding the conflict across the Pacific, what Paine calls the General Asian War.
Exactly. The war in China was a major factor, pushing Japan towards further expansion.
What were the main drivers for widening the war?
Underlying it all was Japan's grand ambition to create this new order in Asia, with Japan at the top. This put it on a collision course with the existing powers, especially the US and Britain, who dominated the global maritime order. And critically, Japan was desperate for resources, especially oil, which it mostly imported.
And the immediate triggers.
Increasing economic pressure from the United States, culminating in that crippling oil embargo in 1941. That really forced Japan's hand, in their view. And then there was the formal alliance with Germany and Italy, the Tripartite Pact, which tied Japan's fate more closely to the European conflict.
Was everyone in Japan on board with attacking the U.S.?
No, there were serious debates. Paine notes that, particularly within the Navy, some leaders were very aware of America's huge industrial potential and warned against starting a war they likely couldn't win long term.
But the hardliners won out.
Yes. The dominant view, pushed by the army and fueled by the desperation caused by the oil embargo, was that a swift, decisive blow was needed. Seize the resource-rich areas of Southeast Asia, knock the U.S. Pacific Fleet out at Pearl Harbor, and then maybe negotiate from a position of strength.
A huge gamble.
Massive. And the attack on Pearl Harbor, while a tactical success initially, was a strategic disaster in the long run.
How so?
It united American public opinion like nothing else could. It turned the U.S. into a determined, implacable enemy focused on total victory. Japan completely miscalculated American resolve and, crucially, America's incredible capacity to mobilize for war.
So after some initial Japanese successes.
Right, they swept through Southeast Asia initially, but the tide turned pretty quickly. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was the crucial turning point at sea. The U.S. decisively defeated the Japanese Navy, sinking 4 of its best aircraft carriers. Japan never really regained the strategic initiative after Midway.
And all this time, the war in China is still going on.
Still grinding on. A massive drain on resources, tying down hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops who were desperately needed elsewhere in the Pacific. It was the quagmire that wouldn't go away.
Did Japan try to get out of the China War?
They made some attempts, even late in the war, to negotiate a separate peace with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, but it never worked out. By then, China was committed, and Allied victory looked increasingly likely.
What finally brought about Japan's surrender?
It was a combination of factors in August 1945, the relentless U.S. island-hopping campaign, the strategic bombing of Japanese cities, the naval blockade strangling imports, then the Soviet Union declared war and invaded Manchuria, which was a huge shock. And finally, of course, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Even then, surrender wasn't automatic, was it?
No. Paine describes the deep divisions within the Japanese government, the Supreme War Council. Military hardliners wanted to fight to the bitter end, mobilize the entire population. It ultimately took the unprecedented intervention of Emperor Hirohito himself to break the deadlock and accept unconditional surrender.
The costs were just staggering.
Catastrophic for Japan. Millions dead, cities destroyed, the economy in ruins, the empire completely gone. And of course, the suffering inflicted on others, particularly the Chinese, was immense, far greater in scale. Japan's whole grand strategy, built around seizing resources, had utterly failed. It just highlighted how dependent they really were on the outside world.
So looking back at this whole sweep of history through Paine's analysis, what are the main lessons or consequences she draws out?
A few really stand out. One is the absolute danger of misidentifying your fundamental geopolitical reality. Japan is an island nation, a maritime power by geography, yet it pursued this continental empire strategy with, well, disastrous results.
That's a crucial point. What else?
The vital importance of balanced institutions, especially that relationship between civilian leadership and the military. When the military gains too much influence, acts independently, or drives policy based on its own interests rather than a national strategy, you're heading for trouble. Japan's case is a stark warning.
The international context matters hugely too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You can't have a successful strategy in a vacuum. The rise of nationalism in China, the growing power of the U.S., these changes in the international environment made Japan's earlier approaches completely unworkable later on. Strategies have shelf lives.
Paine also talks about the difficulty of ending wars.
Yes, the challenge of war termination. When your political goals are unclear, or they keep expanding, or they become disconnected from what's militarily achievable, as arguably happened with Japan and China and then the Pacific, it becomes incredibly difficult to find an acceptable way to stop fighting.
And just the unintended consequences of military actions.
That's a constant theme, isn't it? Japan's aggression consistently backfired, stiffening enemy resolve, uniting opponents like Pearl Harbor did with the U.S. Actions have reactions, often unforeseen ones.
It's quite the historical irony Paine points out at the end.
Isn't it? Japan, after fighting so fiercely against the U.S.-led maritime global order, ends up becoming a core pillar of that very order after the war, protected by the U.S. security umbrella. A complete reversal.
So wrapping up this deep dive, Paine's book really paints a picture of Japan's journey, modernizing power, expansionist empire, devastating defeat as this complex tangle of internal choices, external pressures, and just fundamental miscalculations about its own strengths and its place in the world.
Exactly. It hammers home how crucial it is for any nation to have a clear, realistic grasp of those core elements, its geography, its institutional balance, the international scene when it's trying to figure out its grand strategy.
It really makes you think.
It does. And maybe a final thought for you, the listener, based on everything we've discussed. Considering those long-term consequences, how different might Japan's story in the 20th century and its relationship with Asia have been if it had embraced its maritime geography differently, or if it had maintained a stronger civilian control over the military? And perhaps more broadly, what parallels or maybe warnings can we draw from Japan's experience for nations navigating their own complex geopolitical challenges today? Something to ponder.